Hi fellow Kirkwood Eagles, Curt Miner here. Throughout my 30-plus year career as a minister in the United Church of Christ, I always had an active interest in different religious traditions. So when looking through the options for this historical context presentation assignment in our Literature and Culture American Dreams class, it was pretty much a no-brainer which topic I was going to grab when I saw religion among African American slaves listed. As suggested by Sylvester Johnson, Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University, beginning with transatlantic slavery, which forced hundreds of thousands of people into what is presently the United States, religion among African Americans consistently featured efforts towards survival against structures of racial domination. Over 12 million Africans were abducted and forced into slavery in the Americas. Of these, approximately 20% were Muslims. A minority were also Christians hailing from the Congo Kingdom in West Central Africa, which adopted Catholicism as its official religion in the 1500s. Otherwise, the vast majority were followers of the Orisha, that's O-R-I-S-H-A, type religions indigenous to Africa. Christian missionaries tended to explain Orisha devotion as a demonic religion. Orisha practices were also ridiculed as a form of idolatry, the worship of sticks and stones, and the lowest on a totem pole of so-called heathen religions. Africans themselves rooted their practice of Orisha devotion in a theology of power that viewed the material world as being inhabited by powerful beings, Orisha. Africans believed these Orisha created the material and spiritual worlds with the possibility of connecting with powerful nature spirits through rituals of devotion, such as sacrifice, loyalty oaths, and initiation rites. In these ways, Africans who practiced Orisha devotion paralleled many Christian devotional exercises. For instance, Christians recognized a divine creator God, numerous saints who could be petitioned for assistance, and a host of angels who populated divine and earthly realms to wage battle against the servants of Satan. The Muslim presence throughout the Americas dates back to the 1400s, when Spanish colonizers forced Muslim and non-Muslim Africans into slavery. A number of free African Muslims also participated in the conquest of the Americas or were active as commercial agents. The enslavement of African women, men, and children, however, continually served as the primary means whereby the Muslim population of North America expanded up to the 19th century. Because warfare increasingly became the chief means of forcing Africans into transatlantic slavery, military victories by non-Muslims over Muslims translated into elevated numbers of Muslims among the slaves taken to America. By the 1830s, slaveholders in the United States responded to slave rebellions by dramatically enhancing the use of religion for social control, employing aggressive efforts to convert blacks to Christianity, which undermined the Islamic tradition among enslaved Africans. Catholicism was the earliest and dominant form of African American Christianity. This was partly due to the Congolese adoption of the religion that I mentioned previously, but the most important factor was the arrival of explorers from Spain and North America in the 16th century, where numerous Africans were forced into slavery. Now, in the vicinity of St. Augustine, Florida, North America's oldest colonial city, Africans sought refuge from British slavery in exchange for devotion to Catholicism and military service to the Spanish crown. By the early 1700s, African Catholics operated a small garrison town known as Fort Mose. As the home of a black Catholic army devoted to freeing Africans from British slavery, Fort Mose is an important example of the many forms and meanings that black religion assumed in the context of slavery and colonialism. European colonial settlers eventually led to the growth of Protestantism among blacks in North America. Between the 1790s and 1820, thousands of free Africans throughout the North organized independent congregations. Around the same time that the American colonies were rebelling against the British Crown, free and enslaved Africans in the North were organizing through networks of mutual aid. Among the best known was called the Free African Society of Philadelphia. By the 1780s, this society, organized chiefly by free-born Africans and freed slaves, had become involved with both the Quaker theology and the tradition of Methodism. Now, Methodism was distinguished by its expansive presence throughout the colonies, largely due to its use of revivals, which consisted of a series of religious meetings devoted to cultivating a sense of moral remorse among those who attended. Eventually, in 1816, one group of African American Christians organized themselves into a separate denomination, known as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME. But not all African Methodists were persuaded that following the AME practices and tradition was the only way to proceed. So by 1821, a second group of African Methodists organized themselves into what they called the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or AME Zion, which thrived in its own right, but with fewer members than the AME denomination. The point being, in whatever form, the emphasis of the Methodists on opposing slavery was essential to Africans' devotion to Methodism. Although conversion to Christianity was limited to a small percentage of Africans in the United States before the Civil War, the rate of what is known as Christianization increased over time because of the evangelical methods of Baptists and Methodists, with the central strategy of cultivating extreme forms of religious hatred that inspired black Christians and their white missionary allies to attempt extermination of every vestige of indigenous African religions in the United States and even throughout Africa. In addition, white evangelicals won an audience with blacks because they eagerly invited them to convert and join their churches while condemning slavery and promoting a version of Christianity that was easily accessible to potential converts who lacked formal education. From the late 18th century to the beginning of the Civil War, African Americans generated elaborate and sustained responses to slavery. Unlike the majority of whites who defended the benefits of slavery and who overwhelmingly identified with the institution, African Americans were uniformly opposed to slavery and did not need to be convinced of the humanity of black people or the intolerable destructive nature of slavery in any form. The fact that the institution condoned a system of sexual violence also precipitated religious responses from blacks. In the book that we've read in our class, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote under the pseudonym of Linda Brent, endured years of sexual abuse and violation from James Norcom, the white doctor who enslaved her and her family. Her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, detailed the sexual trauma that she and others endured as female slaves. Jacobs publicly showcased what most Americans knew abstractly. Black women were routinely forced, even as children, into sexual service or harassment at the whim of those who enslaved them. Norcom, to whom Jacobs applies the pseudonym of Dr. Flint, began to target Jacobs for sexual abuse when she was only 15. He was almost 40 years older than she was. She describes crumbling under the heavy burden of shame and self-loathing. Part of the violence that Jacob suffered was related to the moral universe that she inhabited, and this was shaped by the Christian notions of purity and patriarchy that largely defined women's sexuality in that era. To be a woman and a religious person meant embodying sexual purity until marriage. Neither virginity nor marriage were socially acceptable for Jacobs and other enslaved women. Instead, they lived under a norm of Christian morality and social control that made moral impurity almost an impossible pursuit. In this setting, it was victimized women rather than the sexual system of slavery that received both private and public moral condemnation. The religious condemnation of slavery's predatory sexual practices was only one dimension of African Americans' religious engagement with slavery. Even more widespread was a church-based movement that enabled black anti-slavery activists to collaboratively oppose slavery, assist refugees, promote black resettlement for self-determination, lobby white public officials for policy changes, and generate a large social movement to persuade white Americans to oppose the institution of slavery. In addition to institutionalizing their anti-slavery activism, African Americans also developed important religious reforms to reshape the way Americans understood race, religion, and social power. They frequently did so by developing and promoting distinctive interpretations of the Bible, adopting the biblical Exodus narrative of the ancient Hebrews escaping Egyptian slavery through divine assistance. Also important was what came to be known as Ethiopianism, a religious tradition that interpreted Psalm chapter 68, verse 31, which referred to the princes coming out of Egypt and Ethiopia, lifting her hands to the biblical deity as a prophecy that the black race would experience a social uplifting and mass conversion to Christianity in the present age. By the 19th century, Ethiopian was commonly used as a racial designation for blacks. Through the religious leadership of African Americans such as Maria Stewart, David Walker, and Alexander Crummell, this theology of prophetic racial uplifting became an immensely popular aspect of the larger conflict over slavery. So, there you have it. What amounts to the proverbial tip of the iceberg treatment of religion among African American slaves. I hope you learned a few things along the way. And if anything I've said has piqued your interest, I hope you'll do some additional digging of your own.